In the previous section of this chapter, we took up the issue of how Climate Crisis 101 was designed to be as accessible as possible for as many people as possible, which is why you can either read this, watch it, or listen to this material, either as part of a classroom experience or not. However, accessibility doesn't end there. Although this section further explains how Climate Crisis 101 works, it also grapples with digital accessibility. In choosing to put course material online, we need to confront the fact that not everyone will have equal access to it, and not by a long shot. Consequently, in committing to disseminate information online, educators take on an enormous responsibility, as we need to ensure that this material gets out to everyone as equally as possible. I've been thinking about this issue for a number of years now. As I will explain directly, Climate Crisis 101 is an effort to actually do something about the problem. In the first section of this chapter, I explain why this is personally important to me. Suffice it to say that I have long had a dream of truly opening up the traditional university to everyone, everywhere. Climate Crisis 101 brings together much of what I have learned over the years. This is an important social justice issue. So allow me to explain. In July of 2020, when COVID-19 was spreading across the U.S., the New Yorker published an article on, quote, how Harvard star computer science professor built a distance learning empire. I have to admit to being utterly fascinated as I learned that the Harvard course detailed in this article, and that's CS50, is shot in super high resolution 4K video with 5 separate cameras, some of them robotic, in order to make the video of the course lecture, quote, on par with what you'd expect from Netflix. But it's even more than you expect from Netflix, as some of those cameras are $20,000 virtual reality units capable of delivering a 3D experience. Now, let me be clear. Let me be very clear. I absolutely applaud these sorts of experiments. As far as I'm concerned, exploring the cutting edge of distance learning is definitely something that computer science professors should be doing. However, as I have repeatedly noted regarding virtual conferences, I am less interested in tomorrow's technology than yesterday's. Why? Harvard's dorms may be outfitted with enough bandwidth to simultaneously stream 4K video to all the students living there, perhaps even in 3D. However, many students across the U.S. do not have this sort of internet access needed for 4K. This is an important social justice issue, as race, family income, and even the educational level of parents can impact what sort of internet access a student has, as well as the devices that they likely have in their possession. As we shall see, some of our students are only half as likely as others to have access to broadband internet at home, let alone the devices that can actually benefit by it. Sure, some undergraduates own a laptop, a smartphone, and a tablet, but fewer than a third are this fortunate. Have you ever wondered why some students take part in Zoom classes with their webcams off, or even just by phone? Maybe by choice, or it may be the case that they have no choice, as they simply may not have, 1, adequate internet access, or 2, access to a laptop or desktop computer. Does it seem unlikely that many students would be in this predicament? As we shall see, it may be far more likely than you imagine. We've been talking about the digital divide for over 2 decades now. This refers to the gap between those able to benefit from the digital age and those who are not. Unfortunately, that divide hasn't closed in that time and perhaps never will. While more people have access to the internet now than 2 decades ago, access varies greatly. Even if, at some point in the future, all of our students have access to the bandwidth required to stream that 4K Harvard course, there's an emerging standard, 8K. Some YouTube videos are already available at this resolution that requires 4 times the bandwidth of 4K. Regardless of whether, we are considering, 4K or 8K, 3D, which is what that Harvard course is experimenting with, has even greater demands on demands. And that's on the order of like 16 times more bandwidth. Very few consumers have access to this sort of internet. The simple fact is that once the digital divide begins to close, marketers release new technology that keeps opening it up again, such as 4K, 8K, 3D, or whatever. As long as we keep designing for tomorrow's technology, we risk leaving behind quite a few of today's students who may only have access to yesterday's technology. While the digital divide has been a social justice concern for many of us for some time now, it didn't involve immediate action on our part. However, now that we educators are generating and disseminating information online, we need to address this issue directly, lest we too become part of the problem. Regarding the specifics of this issue from a social justice perspective, let's start by looking at the numbers, which are from a 2019 Pew study. Let's start with race. Nearly 4 out of 5 white Americans, 79%, have home broadband. However, if you happen to be black, that number drops to just 2/3, 66%. And 3 out of 5, 61% of Hispanic Americans have broadband at home. So let's talk about income. 92% of Americans who make more than $75,000 per year have broadband at home. Conversely, just 56% of Americans in the lowest income bracket, less than $30,000 a year, have access to it. Education. 93% of Americans with a college degree have broadband at home. Only half that number, 46%, have it if they do not possess a high school degree. Since some Americans opt not to have broadband at all, it's safe to say that if you are white, college educated, and with an income of $75,000 or more per year, you likely have broadband if you want it. On the other hand, for Black and Hispanic households with lower income and parents with less education, half may not have access to broadband. For educators like me, it's also important to take into account international students who may not be on campus, as 14% of UPCSB students are international, and most were not on campus during COVID. This was a significant issue for me at the time. In some places, like China, broadband can be as much as 50 times more expensive than it is in Western countries. What does all this mean for us as educators attempting to deliver video lectures via the internet? As certain of our students are only half as likely as others to have access to broadband internet at home, it would be simply unconscionable for us to design courses that require high-speed access. What then, do we do? The good news is that smartphones often provide internet access for people who do not otherwise have it. The bad news is that race, income, and education also impact smartphone dependence. So here are the numbers regarding race. Only 12% of white Americans depend on their phone for access to the internet. However, that number doubles if you are Black to 23% or Hispanic to 25%. Allow me to repeat that. If you are Black or Hispanic, Latinx, it is twice as likely that you are white than if you are white that you will need to rely on your smartphone for internet access instead of a computer. It's amazing. 1/4 of our Black or Hispanic students may well find themselves in this situation. So what about income? Just 6% of Americans who make more than $75,000 per year need to rely on their phones for internet access. That number more than quadruples to 26% if you make less than $30,000 a year. What about education? Only 4% of college-educated Americans depend on their phones for internet access. However, that number increases 8-fold for Americans who do not have a high school degree. So as dismal as these numbers are, the good news is that 96% of Americans age 18 to 29 have smartphones. Unfortunately, certain students have no choice but to depend solely on their smartphones for internet access. Whether they do so by choice or because they have no choice, a 2017 ECAR study found that 25% of undergraduates used a smartphone for all their courses. The environmental implications here are also more than a little noteworthy, as smartphones operate on about 2 watts of electricity, compared to 50 watts or so to power a laptop and 1,000 or more watts for some gaming desktops. Given that we came to rely on it during COVID, you might be wondering how Zoom compares here. Unfortunately, not well. Everything else being equal, Zoom can more than double required bandwidth. Let's take an example, a video meeting taking place at 1080p, also known as full high definition, which is quickly becoming the streaming standard online everywhere. Now used by Netflix, YouTube, and a range of other services. Zoom's recommended bandwidth for meetings using 1080p video is 2.5 megabits per second, which is comparable to streaming 1080p content elsewhere like Netflix or YouTube. However, Zoom requires even more bandwidth, 3 megabits per second, to send out 1080p from a participant's computer, thereby more than doubling the required bandwidth. It doesn't matter whether we are using low resolution, 720p, higher resolution, 4K. Zoom more than doubles the required bandwidth as we are simultaneously receiving and sending video out. Hence, during COVID, some students had no choice but to either turn their cameras off or resort to calling into meetings. So what's the answer here? It's simple enough. We need to design our courses around the lower end of the installed base of technology, yesterday's technology. Not doing so risks a broad swath of our students missing out and being left behind. Moreover, we need to consider if having a two-way video connection is really necessary for the course at hand. For some large lectures like Climate Crisis 101, I would argue that it simply isn't. I know what you're thinking, that this eliminates having a back and forth conversation either between students and the instructor or students and each other. However, this need not be the case if we shift to text-based interaction. So what would this be like? During COVID, we experienced this by way of Zoom's chat feature. We all did. For many educators, it was a bit of a revelation. It created an entirely separate discussion space, which often rivaled, indeed, and sometimes even surpassed, what was being said in class. Incidentally, as I've experimented extensively with text-based interaction for a nearly carbon-neutral NCN conference model, it is clear that it can be remarkably effective and often is a great deal more depth than a real-time spoken interaction. And the environmental gains in shifting to text-based discussion is extraordinary, as transferring text requires remarkably little bandwidth compared to video. Using the same amount of bandwidth, you could either watch 1 second of that Harvard 4K course or download the whole of War and Peace as an ebook. As I explained in an earlier section, this also means that we can effectively double class time students can watch an uninterrupted, full-length lecture while also taking part in a Q&A that extends over the same time period. In practical terms, at this particular moment in time, I would argue that we need to make sure that our courses run on no more than a quarter of the bandwidth used by that aforementioned Harvard course, which is 4K, which is that resolution we should be using is 1080p. However, given that some of our students do not have consistent access to high bandwidth internet, courses should ideally be designed to be a rewarding experience at a resolution that is a quarter of that, which is 480p. In addition, all of our content should be designed to run on a smartphone, as this not only is the preferred way that many of our students access the internet, for some, it is the only access point they have, and I'll explain more about this directly. Smartphones also provide access to an entirely separate network, cellular, for times when, broadband is not available. These recommendations may seem unreasonable, I know that, especially regarding 480p, which many people regard as an antiquated standard. However, I recall when this standard first came on the scene in the 1990s, as this is the resolution of DVDs. Hence, 480p is also called standard DVD, or more accurately, DVD NTSC. Like most people, I was wowed by the incredible and initially incredibly expensive DVD experience, which remained the most common video delivery standard in the U.S. well into the 2000s, and which is still alive and well today for certain users. Keep in mind that most people initially experienced DVD on home television, some of them quite large, and still found the experience rewarding and often exciting. When viewed on the 5 or 6-inch screens of a smartphone, I would argue that the experience is still completely satisfactory. Conversely, 4K and above is entirely unnecessary, and even 1080p is questionable for smartphones, as Apple's flagship smartphone, at least at the time of this writing, the iPhone 12 Pro, has a resolution that is not at all much more than 1080p, and thus is far less than 4K. And let's not forget the environmental implications of all this. As I noted in the previous section, 20% of the world's electricity consumption may be used by the internet by 2025, and the overwhelming majority of the available bandwidth on the internet is used to stream video. 4K requires 27 times the bandwidth of 480p. This translates into quite a bit of unnecessary carbon emissions. If you read, watch, or listen to the opening section of this chapter, you know that in its current iteration, students are required to come to class to watch Climate Crisis 101, the YouTube lectures. It may seem that this resolves the internet access and device problem. However, I believe that it's important that each and every student has access to the course materials outside of class, allowing them to revisit and study material as much as they want, as often as they would like. Only giving this access to certain students is, as far as I am concerned, just unconscionable. However, even in a course like Climate Crisis 101, the digital divide can present an impasse. What does this mean for us educators? We need to design our courses for presentation on smartphones, not laptops or tablets, though these should obviously also support it. This means, among other things, that we should ideally design our course presentations for screens that are about the size of a 3x5 card. They should also be designed to look appealing at this size. This means little or no text on the screen during the primary lecture, which, as I explore in detail in another section, presents its own set of problems for individuals who are blind or with low vision or vision impairment. It also means that all of the course material should be designed to be read on a smartphone, which is one of the reasons the Climate Crisis 101 appears like an ebook on a mobile device. Given that some students only have intermittent access to the internet, all of the course material, including the video talks and audio podcasts, should ideally be downloadable. Because it's not generally possible to do this with YouTube, Climate Crisis 101 traditionally has used a second video archive, Vimeo, which also allows videos to be downloaded in resolutions down to 240p, which is 1/4 of the size of 480p. Since bandwidth is such an important issue, video should also be designed to exploit data compression algorithms. For example, in the videos for Climate Crisis 101, I am filming against a solid black backdrop. Consequently, in terms of pixels on the screen, well over half of them are a single color. Because data compression algorithms are designed to exploit statistical redundancy, like having a lot of the same colored pixels on the screen, this means that everything else being equal, when compressed, these videos are half the size they would be otherwise. The stark white backdrop also provides for a simplified visual field, which may help individuals with low vision or vision impairment. Ensuring that the material can be streamed and downloaded as audio greatly reduces the demand for bandwidth. As I previously noted, excellent quality audio requires as little as 4% of the bandwidth of video. Of course, this means that the material needs to be designed for audio presentation. And of course, providing the course material as a downloadable text requires the least bandwidth of all. Using the same amount of bandwidth, you could either download 1 or 2 seconds of Climate Crisis 101 as a video or the entire book in text form. So what does this mean for our students? First, whether you can see the course material or not, or see it well, or hear it well, or hear it at all, it ideally shouldn't matter at all. Moreover, being able to attend a lecture and access course material anywhere at any time with just your phone opens up a world of possibilities. Simply grab your phone and go and search a nice quiet place to pop in your earbuds, perhaps some comfy grass under a nice quiet tree. What better place to read and to listen to or to watch a lecture on climate crisis and the environment?